We popped up this chart. Very simply, are there any signs of a little bit of fatigue, a little bit of Brexit impact? What's causing the turn?
I don't think there are in our business, and I think that's true for most of our sort of major competitors. I think what you do see at the moment, and maybe is behind that sort of share price softness, is less certainty, less volume in the second-hand market. And of course, the two in the long term are linked, but for our own sales performance out on site, our actual trading, it remains very strong.
What's your assessment then of the budget and what difference it's going to make to your business? We've seen this big change in stamp duty, removing stamp duty for first-time buyers up to a certain amount. Is that just going to drive price inflation, as some of the critics have suggested?
I think if you stand back and look at the budget as a whole, we have to look in the context, because the housing industry has been the centre of political policy for quite a number of years now, so it's not just one step. And so there are some quite significant new steps in there, but it's a collective thing. So the whole approach to both supply and demand in housing has changed. I don't think in isolation those stamp duty changes are huge. I think they are positive for first-time buyers. I think it's a little bit overcritical to feel that they just end up in prices, because I don't think that's true. Some things do, but I don't think that will.
So you think that's overcritical? I mean, in terms of London, yeah, you might say £5,000, maximum on a deposit, and that'd be great for a first-time buyer. But does that really move the dial on affordability, given where we've got to in London?
I think it doesn't when you look at it as part of the house price. And I would not say that those stamp duty changes are dramatic in their impact. But where it does make a difference for individuals is house buying is around the margin. It's the most difficult thing for young people is saving up the deposit, saving up the moving costs, and there are a bigger proportion of those moving costs. So I'm not saying that this is earth-shattering, going to change the world, but it is meaningful to young people right at that point of buying a house.
The other big driver was, I think Hammond's comment was front and centre. Housing is front and centre. And he talks about a land bank review, but Bloomberg Intelligence have run some of the numbers. In the UK, you've got nearly 300,000 permits, and in the UK, you've got nearly 323,000, the whole of the UK. You've got 323,000 permits being issued. So approvals and supply, there is this divorce between approvals and supply. How do you close that gap meaningfully, let's say, in this tenure?
I think it's that last bit that makes it difficult. It's timing. So if you look at our business, and I don't think we're hugely different to the sector as a whole in this particular area, over the last 10 years, we've got almost exactly the same number of approvals as we've built.
Yes.
But what you have seen, inevitably the approvals have to lead the build. And they have to lead it by some time, because actually it takes something up to about 18 months on a large site to get all of the main infrastructure and actually be delivering houses. And so there is always a lag, but that doesn't mean there's always a gap. So over time, the two should close, but it takes quite a long time for that to happen.
It takes time for it to happen. I mean, some things from the 1970s we want to leave well behind, don't we? But the rate at which we're adding to housing stock, perhaps something that we want to replicate. So 300,000 is now the target. Are we going to see that now as a result? And to Manus's question about the closing that gap, are we going to see that 300,000 achieved?
I think, again, it gets back to timing. I do believe that we, as a country, are perfectly capable of building 300,000 homes. But doing it properly, doing it in the right places, doing it at a high quality with the right skills takes time. And so on the timescales that set out, probably not. But is it a realistic medium-term aim, and therefore is it a sensible aim? Probably. I just think sometimes that the timescales tie into a political cycle rather than the real world.
You talk about the ability to deliver on those. I noticed in your last set of numbers, building costs are up about 3 to 4%, in part due to labour, in part due to inflation. You're the best man in the world to find out whether it's hard to get a plumber. I need an electrician, if anybody can send me one. But on a sort of a moderately more serious note, are you seeing a tightness in labour? Are you seeing, a lot of red tops, of various big red top stories about migration. Is there a tightness in labour? And is there a correlated effect in terms of European nationals not being as available as they were? What is the truth?
I think there is a very significant tightness of labour in our sector, but I don't believe it has very much to do with European nationals and to do with Brexit.
So what's it to do with?
It's to do with the fact, and it goes back to what we've just been talking about. The latest statistics out show that house building grew by 15% last year. That's a huge growth for any industry drawing in skills. And historically, we're a cyclical industry. We've not been brilliant at investing consistently over the years. The industry is getting and got quite a lot better, but it's going to take quite a long time to get those skills right. And actually attracting people in to a traditional industry, is more difficult than it perhaps was in the 1970s.
So the government talked last week about that investment in skills. They also talked about encouraging small and medium-sized constructors of housing. Is that a threat to your business? Obviously, they're all small, but you can all grow together, can you? Or do you have to give some ground?
We don't see it as a threat. We actually, sort of see it as an important part of a healthy industry. But I do think it's very, very difficult because these small and medium house builders we're talking about, and there are exceptions, of course, actually don't really exist anymore at the moment. They slowed down, stopped, wound up, people retired at the end of the or during the recession, and there hasn't been new startups. And so I think where the focus should be, how do we encourage startups, and not necessarily just small startups, how do we encourage more equity into the sector in a general sense. So just taking away the funding limitations for them isn't enough. They need more small sites, but actually more of a why aren't people starting up businesses in what's actually a very financially, sort of successful sector at the moment.
Yeah, as you say, the growth has been at 15%. There's not many sectors that have delivered that kind of growth. You have a strong balance sheet, your words, and you have a high-quality land bank. So we use this trashy cliche in markets, which is buy the dip, buy the dip, buy the dip. I almost feel like a market trader. But when you look at land banks in the UK, where are the big opportunities? And if there is softness, no cycle ever lasts in perpetuity. Where do you want to buy the dip in the land bank?
Well, and if you mean where in terms of geography, we
Yes.
see a huge virtue in being very broadly based. Our business doesn't turn in quick cycles. The house prices do, but
Yes.
the ability to invest does not. Our largest sites can last for 15 years, so you need to be able to make decisions that can work through the cycle. And see, we have businesses from sort of Edinburgh and Glasgow down into Exeter, and we see that as a huge virtue. So we don't want to be hugely London-centric. So we'll buy some sites. We have bought a couple of large sites in London at the moment because the land market is softer.
Yeah.
But actually it's not huge.
One thing we didn't hear much news about was Help to Buy. It carries on. Are you planning for a time when Help to Buy doesn't exist anymore? Do you sense that maybe it's going?
We always have done ever since it started. And I was operating in housing in the same business, but we owned a house builder in the US at the time of the last crisis. And I saw the impact of a withdrawal of support through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac on the US housing industry at the worst possible time. So we kind of always assume the worst on that. So we're always slightly cautious. Any industry wanting to be heavily dependent on government support, needs to question itself, I think.